Hey, how you doing?
Good. How are you?
Good. I'm trying to blow some tobacco smoke on the screen to symbolically purify the communication channel.
Oh, nice.
It's not
You
working
know,
very well.
with all these Zoom calls, this is the first time I've had that happen, and I'm actually surprised this is the first time.
I would think there would be more shamanic technological penetration by this point.
You think? Well, it's good to reconnect. I like what you guys have been doing. I've just been trying to sink into all the content you've been producing. It's quite a bit. It's great. Future Faces of Spirit. Watched a couple of those with like Brad and Joran and Bonita Roy. So yeah, I'm looking forward to digging into the John Vervaeke one. Haven't gotten to that yet, but yeah, nice stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff on there. I can barely keep up with it. It's hard enough just to participate, let alone view it all and digest it.
Yeah, yeah,
All right, I'll do a little intro for this thing.
sure.
Get going.
Great.
How did that go? Right. This is a new series on the Integral Stage. We're going to be talking with podcasters, YouTubers, and their ilk, people who are trying to offer or who can't help but offer more integrative perspectives. That means a focus on transforming, transcending, integrating, upgrading, and evolving within hybrid, more complex, meta-level, and depth-oriented spaces and practices. Who are these people doing this? What do they collectively understand and point towards? How can they be interlinked, mutually supported, clarified, and amplified? That's the project. We'll see what emerges. Helping us think through it today is Jeremy Johnson, neo-Gebserian, integral leftist, and a driving force behind things like Mutations and Growing Down. Jeremy, before we get into some issues, maybe you'd give us a sense of what are these internet communication projects that you're involved in and where can people find them?
Sure. That's one hell of an intro, Layman. That's great. Did you memorize that?
Yeah, I had notes for it when I did it with Stephanie, but now I got it pretty good.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah. So first of all, thanks for having me on. It's great to be involved in this project, and I've been involved in a couple of different domains. I've got my own podcast that I've been running for a couple of years. It's a slow cooking, slow brewing show called Mutations. So it's not very high demand or high productivity, but I still try to have very substantive conversations about the evolution of consciousness, alternative scholarship, etc. And on top of that, I've recently started the Growing Down podcast with my co-hosts Ryan and Matt. Growing Down is more explicitly related to the integral community in that we're looking for, we're looking to provide a kind of alternative leftist-oriented perspective on current events and politics from an integrally informed community, right? So we all associate ourselves as integralists or identify as integralists in some way or some fashion. And in sort of the mainstream or mainstream, like through integral life, through kind of the more main branches of integral production, integral media, there really isn't a leftist wing, right? Folks who are kind of really swimming in that. So we wanted to provide that. And the whole idea behind Growing Down is essentially there's so much emphasis on growing up, waking up, showing up, cleaning up, up. So what happens if we take the Hillman approach, right? The whole theme of Growing Down for James Hillman is this sense of like growing your roots down into the world, right? Ensoulment, how to fully participate in the depths of your life, in life, as, all of the struggles and pathos that emerge in that. So I like that as a theme. It's sort of a countercurrent. It's something a little bit different. And that's why we ended up calling it Growing Down. But the whole idea is to really get involved in material politics, transformative change through a kind of materialist lens. And I don't mean this in like the extreme sense of materialism, but just having a literacy around, the material basis of economics and politics, et cetera. So long story short, those are the two podcasts. And I'm also involved in all these other projects, of course, but we can kind of orbit around things and bring them up as they come up. So
sure, we'll traipse through a lot of that stuff, I'm sure. On this Growing Down thing, like I think a lot of people when they think of growing down think immediately of embodiment and of reconnecting shadow material and emotional material and physiological material. How do you see that linking into the project of progressive politics?
yeah, great question. Unfortunately, I don't think in progressive politics there's much of an emphasis on that either, right? Or even in the Hillman sense of ensoulment and depth psychology. So that's kind of, and this is something I've been talking with Matt about, especially on the podcast. I think, like, working with shadow, working with these elements that of meaning making that the left hasn't really addressed, right? And I can't really speak to embodiment practices or embodiment studies myself, but that's certainly, we'd certainly be open to exploring that with somebody who wanted to come on the show and talk about it. But I think that the left is sort of going through its own potential transformation right now, not only in the United States, but I think globally speaking. We've been seeing, of course, the rise of authoritarian regimes, and of course, with the current pandemic and the economic bailout, that there's certainly a civilizational crisis going on, and the question is, like, why isn't the left succeeding at providing the answers in a way, that we would expect it to, or we were hoping to have more traction with at this point? So I think there's a lot of soul searching actually right now, and I think it's a good opportunity. I've been talking a lot with Michael Brooks. He's the host of the Michael Brooks Show and co-host of the Majority Report. And one of the things that he mentions in his new book, Against the Web, is the need for the left to develop a kind of, he calls it a cosmopolitan socialism, a cosmopolitan socialist answer to the new right. And what he means by that partly is actually looking at these questions, right? Like actually bringing up questions of, well, the left is meant to or supposed to be representing this kind of answer to alienation in culture, sort of an answer to capitalism and the alienating nature of our economic ideology. So why aren't we talking more about meaning making? Why aren't we talking about ensoulment? Why do we write off people who have some kind of religious identification or affiliation as being I don't know, that there's all sorts of negative statements about people who have a spiritual bent. So like those kind of riffs really need to be looked at. And what Brooks is arguing for, and I think is a very integral perspective, is that we have to address the meaning crisis, like Vervaeke would be positing, as part of the answer that the left needs to offer people. So that's sort of, for me anyway, like that's what I'm really looking at in terms of my contributions to the podcast is how can we use this leftist orientation, but be bringing in more substantive, meaning-making questions and spiritual questions, so people don't necessarily funnel to the right, or funnel into the intellectual dark web, looking for those answers, right? Because the left isn't really addressing them directly. So that's a kind of a mediational project. I think it's still prefigurative in that I don't know how well the left is really doing this or how well people are listening to Brooks and people like Brooks, but I think this is the project right now, and hence I think it's an integral project. So I don't know if that directly answered your question there, but
no, but it's a great theme.
yeah.
The idea of what progressives need to fold in, the other
Yeah.
dimensions of experience they need in order to have the energy of a complete platform seems essential. You made me think while you were talking of a couple of years ago, Jordan Peterson interviewed Camille Paglia, and she was sort of pushing back on his understanding of postmodernism. She was saying that all the real postmodernists she knew left and went back to the land, that they were focused on ecological and somatic experience, and none of the real ones went into academia. So that down the line, the academic impression of what postmodernism stands for is actually something way off base. So what do you think people get wrong about postmodernism, pluralism, progressivism, green? Like, in general, what are the limiting misconceptions that people come at it from?
Oh, yeah. Well, I think this is not just an integral centric question either, right? Because this is sort of part of the larger culture war. But I think some of the worst aspects of our current communication medium and social media, like Twitter and dogpiling on Twitter, it represents sort of not necessarily a problem exclusive to the left, but a problem that is endemic to the media ecology we find ourselves swimming in terms of tribalization, mass dogpiling on somebody who we want to cancel, etc. So I think the left certainly has has some issues with this, and folks like Mark Fisher, right, in his essay Exiting the Vampire Castle, I think is a sort of a good example of the left kind of critiquing itself. But in terms of green meme and the way the left has been sort of framed, maybe by integralists as being, well, we want everybody to be equal and we want it now, and we have this kind of totalizing puritanical vision for the way the world needs to be. I think the most vocal people on the left on the internet might be like that. I think, you know, people on college campuses might be like that. Not everybody, but they're certainly not representative of everyone on the left. And then there's this deeper question, which isn't really an answer or a solution, but there's a kind of bifurcation, I feel, between quote unquote woke left communities and culture and more quote unquote classical left in terms of the economic focus, right? And I think the neoliberal ideology has been very successful at capturing the identitarian element of the left and kind of going, you know, we can have a racially, ethnically diverse CEO of some company like Pepsi or something along those lines, and still kind of produce and reify the same violent economic patterns. You know, so I think that that's one of the biggest divides that we're also trying to overcome is coalition build between, again, the more identity oriented leftists and then the more economically oriented leftists. They need to get along better. So I think the left is a bit fractioned and I think it's a bit fragmented, but that's not necessarily all the left's fault. I think this has to do more with some of the underlying media, as I mentioned earlier, the underlying media ecologies of our culture, which are still very much rooted in perspectival fragmentation, right? I think this is a kind of the part of the crisis of consciousness in our time, right? That our technologies and social technologies exacerbate perspectivalism over actually building coalitions, right? And then our economic drivers, in terms of neoliberalism, continue to capture and take advantage of that fragmentation and atomization and actually really thrive off of it. So we're kind of dealing with an socially environmental crisis here. So long story short, you know, we can see the polarization take place and see the reaction to the kind of overzealousness of the left, the mean green meme, I think, in culture. And we can understand some of the pressure has been, you know, people go to the intellectual dark web as a sort of a counter to what they see online. And I understand those things. You know, I think that's definitely a legitimate criticism. But again, you know, I think without a literacy in some of these economic ideologies which drive this fractioning and atomization, you know, we're not really being able to get to the heart of it. You know, we're not really being able to get to the remedial possibilities to overcome these cultural divisions. And then as a Gebserian, I would say, you know, the perspectivalism that our culture and our technology extends into the world is not really being addressed either. So the question is, like, can we create an aperspectival or integral internet? You know, what would that look like? What would the economic aspect of that look like? And then also, what would the social technologies look like? Would they be as perspectively atomizing as we have today? Or would they have some kind of solution to these crises? So again, not in a direct answer exactly. It's a sort of an environmental answer, but I'm trying to hold all of those things.
Yeah, well, we should be looking at the concept of the media. If we're talking about podcasting and things like that, you're involved very much in the internet media ecology. How would you compare it to things like the television and radio ecology and the book ecology, right? Obviously, there's a distance, very personal one-way transmission from a book writer, and I know you've written. TV has this also one-directional aspect to it, but it comes in teams of people who communicate a kind of, the propaganda is in the framing of how they put forward their one-way communication. The internet allows this multi-directional two-way communication in a more relaxed style, but it also has these potentially negative swarming effects that you were mentioning. So how would you rate those different things? What's more effective in terms of coalition building and sense making? What's more dangerous in terms of fragmentation?
Yeah, great question. I don't know if I think the internet is more of both. I think in many ways it is more a more clear expression of McLuhan's electronic culture and even Gebser's understanding of aperspectivity in its sort of rhizomatic and networked expression. But on the other hand, I think it's still very much driven by certain ideological forces that are deeply perspectival, or what Gebser would say, mental rational or mental structure of consciousness. So it's kind of Janus faced. And I think we see that, both in the potential of networks to coalition build, and then the kind of atomization of these networks and tribalization that we continue to see. So I would say it's both. It really is kind of exacerbating the worst of the mental rational and some of the like potentially best of the integral, right? Of the rhizomatic age. So the tensions are there, and I don't think we've really fully worked them through yet. Especially with the economic pressures to sort of maintain reality tunnels and reality bubbles, especially on Facebook and Twitter, where you can really insulate yourself in your own media ecology. And there's a lot of economic drivers for that, and sort of aggregating your data, selling it back to you, et cetera. So, there's some conflicting forces in the internet medium in which, there is a subtler sublimation of that framing, whereas like maybe in television it was easier to catch because it's literally a box and it has a certain ideology around it. And there's tons of great literature and academic literature about, the age of television and sort of the inframing of culture and ideology and propaganda. So it's a little bit more two-dimensional, but I think with the internet, it's still going on. It's just sort of hyper complexified, right? And sort of underneath the surface, but it's still going on, right? And as McLuhan would say, if it's still in the medium, it's still influencing us. It's still in the background, not in the foreground. So overcoming that, I think, is going to be very difficult. But I think people are always experimenting with different, alternative communication mediums in terms of getting off of Facebook and exploring not cryptocurrency exactly, but blockchain alternatives. But we're still very much, again, in this middle space between the two, both fragmenting and connecting at the same time. And that's what's so frustrating about this moment.
How do you personally get outside of information cul-de-sacs that are being sold back to you?
Yeah. What's funny? I think, the concept of McLuhan's retrieval is helpful here. Going back to old mediums, just going back to books sometimes can be a good way to shift in terms of like, all right, this is not catering an exact message for me, right? If I go read a book that I'm not very familiar with, or an academic tradition I'm not very familiar with, there's a lot of intersections that start to hit me from different fields and different perspectives. So I would say retrieval, and then maybe retrieval in the sense of going analog. And maybe this is one of the reasons why, this is not always the case, but I think it's one of the reasons why podcasts have become so popular over the text in this time, because the oral tradition of communicating with another person, just like what we're doing right now and what millions of podcasts are doing, there's this analog dimension to conversation through the podcast, and especially the ones that don't like edit things down to like the 10-minute NPR interview that's like highly curated and polished, but like the 2-hour-long conversations where dialogue can kind of flow organically and move from point to point. We see the more complex, rich, dialogical dimensions of human experience and positions and points of view, and where the tensions arise, where the overlaps arise, etc. So I think the oral medium, which is being retrieved in the digital age, is actually very hopeful. It's bringing the human back into the center, and I think that's certainly a way to kind of break that mold to some degree. Now I know like there are plenty of intellectual dark web podcasts, et cetera, but it's a start. At least it's a start. So,
well, speaking of podcasts, who do you listen to? Who do you go to? Who do you think has got a good handle on the medium in terms of what it could be, or the essence of what it is?
Hmm.
Who do you like as a podcaster and why?
Oh, well, there's I listen to so many podcasts. I love Weird Studies. I don't know if you've listened to the Weird Studies podcast, Phil Ford and JF Martell. I think they have some of the best conversations, and it really is just their rapport together and the structure of their conversations. They've got it really down very well. They actually have a recent one about Marshall McLuhan that I think is one of their best. But I would say them. I really like Connor Habib. His Everyone Against Connor Habib is a great show. He's recently had on Shreko Horvath and a few months ago Bifo Berardi. So he's at the interesting intersection of occultism, integral philosophy, and leftist politics. And he himself has, I think, a very interesting worldview, and he's able to talk to sex workers, leftist philosophers, and of course more esotericists. So very interesting combinations there, right? Very interesting nexus there. So I think he's great. But I don't know if they're doing anything particularly innovative with the medium. I just think who they are as people and what their talent is being able to hold these intersectional spaces very well, and maybe that's the skill that I really like. For Weird Studies is the same thing. Like, these guys are very interested in the weird, and they bring very different types of media together to discuss, from McLuhan to occult horror to literature and William Blake, or to H.P. Lovecraft. So I like the literary elements. I like the literary element being retrieved in the podcast medium. That's just my disposition. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. How significant do you think the weird really is? Like, when we look at the situation the world is in right now, one way to look at it is there's just some very sophisticated embedded systems of exploitation that we need to fix, and we're suffering economically and physiologically and spiritually from these bad systems. But another way to look at it is shit just keeps getting weirder. Each one of the moves isn't just the government screwed up. It's a screw up where you go, holy shit, how can this be happening?
Yeah.
Right? There's a Terence McKenna kind of logic where the future consists of an acceleration towards the peculiar, and we're getting increasingly intense and increasingly frequent hits of this strangeness. It does seem like everything is really bizarre all the time, but that might just be a secondary effect. So how do you look at that? Is there a reality to increasing weirdness?
Yes, I think, and I'll answer this from a Gebserian perspective. The way Gebser understood these movements into these new structures of consciousness is that they're both phenomenological and then ontological, right? Like, what is being, what is the world, and what is time, and then of course what is the self in relation to those things, and then let's look at how we perceive and what perception is and what organs of perception we're using to encounter that world, that being. And these have gone through dramatic restructurings, and I think during those times things can get very weird and topsy-turvy. And the strange, the uncanny, the liminal, we live in a time like that right now. We live in a sort of restructuration period. The meta-moderns talk about that quite a bit. It's, they originally called it a structure of feeling. There's this sense that the arc of modernization is coming to an end, but we don't quite know what's really emerging here. So I would say, like, that the weird and the liminal is where we're inhabiting right now. It's just like our mode of being. And I think in terms of that intensifying, sure. Ontologically speaking, the integral for Gebser is very weird for a modernist or somebody in the perspectival world to consider, right? He talks about it's about the supersession of that subject-object duality. It's about the collapse of distinctions between nature and culture and self and other, and those kinds of twistings, right? Those kind of liminalities that begin to be perceived in the world, so that distinctions and dichotomies begin to have a different relationship to each other. So is culture becoming nature in the Anthropocene, right? Like, these are the kind of questions a lot of people are asking, not only in academia but also very like practically. When you are in a place like I am right now, I'm living in Florida. When you encounter a hurricane, you're also kind of encountering human civilization in that hurricane if it's an abnormally powerful one, right? Because you go, okay, so how much is this influenced by human behavior and human activity collectively, right? Carbon emissions, etc. And so there's this kind of strange entanglement with the world that I think we're all experiencing. And the theme, of course, is like for folks like Tim Morton who talk about hyper objects, right? Is this becoming ecological or being ecological? Is this sense that human culture and civilization is twisting into nature, which is twisting into culture. And so we are just living in the weird. I think the aperspectival age is almost defined by its sense of strange diaphany, right? Of transparency suddenly with the dimensions that we had either cut ourselves off from or neglected. And then also, the future and what we're becoming. The future is very imminent in the way Gebser describes integral consciousness. So yes, short answer is yes. The zone. I just did a Mutations watch party for Stalker, Andrei Tarkovsky's Stalker, and the theme of zones came up, and of course, the weird and the zone are kind of synonymous with one another, right? Entering a space where reality has different rules or principles, and in Tarkovsky's Stalker, of course, right? There's this. Very similarly, there's this kind of unity of the individual and the zone that is begun. It's sort of hinted at throughout the film, but sort of is consummated in this end scene where the characters are invited to walk through this doorway, this threshold, where their deepest desires may come true. And there's this hesitation for that final, like J.F. Martel calls it, this final consummation with the other, right? So the weird is sort of, it's about this twisting. It's about the becoming of other. And it's about really kind of discovering that there's an element of us that is uncanny and weird, right? There's an element of our own identity, which has, like Rilke might say, like this intensified sky. There's a strange interiority to us. So that's what Gebser's integral is kind of about. And so when I see everything going on in the news today, I'm going like, all right, the weird is this aperspectival, right? So that's kind of the long story short there.
Sure, yeah. The Bardo realms are proliferating.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I like what you said about the hurricane. I like this idea, and I guess it's a kind of Gebserian notion that is, things would be expected to be more weird if more things were showing forth in every event, right? Where you see human civilization in the hurricane. If you see more of everything and anything, that's got to add some kind of uncanny intensity to your perception.
Yeah. And Morton's object-oriented ontology is a lot of fun with this too. If you can work your mind around all of the different weird concepts and the way he writes and everything, but it's fun to think about everything as a hyper object in that sense of everything you encounter is that strange stranger. Everything you encounter is the singularity, right? How would we function as a culture if that became more and more transparent to us, right? The singularity of any object in perception is something that is not perspectively fixed, but actually open, and at the same time not collapsible to the concept of the thing, right? It's like the third table from Graham Harman, or that notion. So while I don't think we're going to be running around in a world that is just increasingly becoming like an H.P. Lovecraft film or something, or adaptation, I do think this sense of perception is going to aesthetically and culturally continue to intensify in our culture, whatever this emergent culture is going to be. And it's kind of, I see some hopeful signs of this being also a move into, like you mentioned, a lot of postmodernists from Camille Paglia saying that, folks are going back to localization and working with growing things. And I hear an echo of that in like a lot of the communities I pay attention to, especially like Joe Brewer's work on regenerative culture. I think there's going to be a move, and necessarily so, into the local, the bioregional, right? just out of all of the different climate disruptions that we're going to be experiencing. And of course, if you take seriously folks like Jem Bendell and Joe Brewer about what could be happening or unfolding in the next few decades, we're not just looking at minor cultural shifts or interruptions, rude interruptions of modernity. We're looking at a system-wide civilizational collapse, but collapse and recreation happen at the same time. So we don't know what the new culture is going to be exactly, but I have the sense that it is more of this ontologically weird culture, right, that has superseded some of these dichotomies that modernity has had a lot of difficulty doing. Maybe something much more McLuhan-esque and Gebserian-esque, but we will see. Yeah.
I think there's so many. When you move past formal to post-formal or modern to pluralistic or integrative or whatever that is, you're heading into a space where there's so many networks and so many tangles, and your odds of juxtaposition go up dramatically.
Yeah.
Right? I think in some ways you can say the whole cognitive mindset there is the result of just experiencing so many odd intersections that you become really skilled and comfortable with that and start to think how that could go forward.
Mm-hmm.
That can't help but be uncanny. Every juxtaposition is uncanny, I think, by nature.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But there's an interesting thing there that, that localism thing makes me want to ask a question about where are the temperamental weaknesses of what we might call the left? Because obviously there's got to be a deeper internal ability to understand and work with ecological patterns. There's got to be more distributed control centers. There's got to be more local robustness in our production and supply chain. All that stuff's great, but there's also this sometimes like a fallback to the local, just like there's a fallback to the idea that the future requires us to do less, right, to produce less energy, to have fewer people. Is that essential, or is there a danger in that kind of retreat position? Just like there might be a danger in not doubling down and being aggressive enough in one's progressive politics.
Yeah. Great question. I think we have to distinguish what it means to go back to the local, or even if it really is going back per se, because we have. I use Bruno Latour's thinking on this because he actually plays with these different trajectories, and he has this great book called Down to Earth. And it's a very interesting exploration of that exact question, the global versus the local. And then he's suggesting that, modernity has actually always been on this track, right? That modernization has always been this kind of upward thrust into increasingly globalized, increasing capital, increasing vistas of new markets, et cetera, that kind of capture the world, right, and move us into colonialism, to 20th century colonialism, to 21st century digital capitalism. This is the trajectory we've been on, and then the right has been sort of this interesting kind of counterbalance to that, which goes, oh, let's go back to the local. Let's not be all about this multicultural neoliberal globalist world. We want to relocalize. We want to go back to our roots, right? So there's been this countercurrent to that, which has traditionally been understood through the right. And Latour suggests that, when it comes to the climate crisis, we're kind of being hit from like a sidereal realm. Speaking of the weird and the uncanny, there's this intersecting kind of impact of the earth, right? That the utopian ideal, the pristine ideal of capital and free markets and industrial capitalism is this arc that modernity is on. It never existed. The earth is not compatible with the ultimate totalizing vision of capital. And so we're being kind of blindsided now by all these climate disruptions. And so the question becomes like, okay, well, we probably do need to relocalize in some fashion, or come down to earth in some fashion. But is it the same thing as the traditional left-right global local dichotomies? And he says, no, it's actually a third attractor. He says it's the terrestrial. And by the terrestrial, he means both the left and the right, if they're going to actually ground themselves in the realities of terrestrial politics and terrestrial economics, they actually need to learn and discover a way to subsist on a limited finite planet, right, with limited resources, with a living ecology and the dynamics of that, and actually cater an economic system and a production system around that, lest we continue to have these intensified crises and disruptions. So Latour kind of suggests that we're going to have to learn how to live with the earth and the terrestrial, and the original left-right dichotomy of global-local is a fiction. It's an imagined past, and then there's also an hallucinatory future which doesn't exist, that linear arc. He actually has a line in this book which I highlighted and like wrote like a Gebserian note, like temporix, in the margins, because he wrote the arc of modernity's time has twisted. Right, so there's this idea of the twisting of time, this twisting of this progressive arc. So I would say, like, kind of to rephrase and sort of simplify from that, I would say that the local in this sense is not exactly the same thing. It's more along the lines of what Michel Bauwens talks about with cosmo-localism, right? That, you know, being bioregional and having localized supply chains, et cetera, but while connected, perhaps through networks, perhaps through some future version of the internet, still, you know, building coalitions and planetary meshworks at the global scale is the way we can actually move into globalization that is not modernity's globalization, if that makes sense, right? Modernity's vision of a planetary unity is actually a perspectival illusion. And what we're really doing now is kind of retreating a little bit and kind of reorienting ourselves to the terrestrial, to the organic, to living systems, et cetera, and then kind of coming up from there again. And so I kind of see it as almost a modernity as this cul-de-sac, and or this sort of wave or pulse of this vision of the planetary, but it didn't really pan out. And so, you know, life finds a way, and we're kind of moving and redirecting. And I've made this distinction too. I don't know if this would help at all, but I think there is a distinction between globalization and planetization. And globalization is rooted in, again, these ideological, progressive-oriented trends of modernity. Planetization is much more rooted in the cosmo-local, bioregional, and not exactly progressive economics, but certainly some kind of post-capitalist economic system that can work in a steady state with the environment. So they're kind of we're kind of at a forking point, right? Globalization is broken. It's not going to work. We need to find a way to go planetary somehow. And I would say that's sort of the biggest distinction between the old form of localism and this new form of localism, which is cosmo-local in that sense.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely, in my own terminology, I tend to put planetary on one side and global and international on the other, or at the lower level.
Yeah.
You're talking about this sort of, you know, there's a structural logic that's implicit in a lot of this stuff, in the cul-de-sac illusion of modernity and the totalizing vision of capital, and let's say also the vanishing point of perspectival painting, right? Mm-hmm. So somebody sees the limitations of that, breaks free of that, starts to see that there's these other possibilities, starts to acknowledge them, verbally affirms them, maybe even verbally affirms them in their political platforms, but doesn't necessarily act them out, doesn't really become their champion or avatar in the world. What's missing? Even when you can get cognitively past the limiting of perspectivalism, what is it that people still need then? Is it moral coherence? Is it some kind of emotional understanding? What do people lack in terms of bringing that into the world, even if they get it?
Yeah. Well, I think that's actually a good side rail conversation in and of itself, and what it means to go meta, right? You know, Zach Stein has been writing a bit about that. And I recently just wrote an essay for the Side View Journal, actually exploring that question, which is, we're talking about, you know, integral consciousness and planetary consciousness, and so many communities are already talking about it, right? Conceptually, they understand it, but there's all this difficulty in actually how to implement it, embody it in their lives, etc. And I think part of this is sort of really and this is where I think Gebser kind of comes in and can be helpful in this sense, because his orientation is almost entirely phenomenological when it comes down to what you're doing when you're doing the work in terms of how does integral consciousness come online in myself. And a lot of it is a self-observation. How do the modes of perception, right? Like, am I identifying thinking with being? How am I embodying the mental structure? I need to really understand it phenomenologically in my body, right? How these structures of consciousness express themselves. And it's a lot of internal work. It's like you really got to get familiar in a non-abstract sense with the mental. Like, we think of the mental as abstraction, or the perspectival world as abstraction, but as you mentioned, the vanishing point, right? Standing in perspectival space. There's a physical orientation to perspectivity, right? That comes online. It's an extension of the human body and the nervous system, as McLuhan might say. So it really requires us to kind of get familiar with our own felt sense, right? Our own felt sense of perception. And I think the same thing with the integral. Like, if we really want to understand the integral, I think the danger of going meta here, the ambiguity here is always that it's very easy for those of us who are intelligent enough to conceptually understand what going meta might mean or becoming integral could mean. But actually, as an embodied felt sense, not all of us have that ability, right? Or we might conflate the two. We might conflate the two with, well, Tim Morton says it this way. He says, modernity has always been about going meta, actually, in that intellectual sense. Anything you can do, I can do meta. It's always about, okay, how do I capture what you're doing and have this higher perspective? How do I capture what that's doing and have a higher perspective? That's not integral, right? At least according to Gebser. Integrality is more of this concrete felt sense of wholeness, of volition, and it's a mode of perception. It might incorporate being able to think very complexly, but it doesn't necessitate it. So for me in the essay, I'm kind of exploring how do we gain or cultivate a felt sense of the whole. And first of all, I point out that aesthetics, art, poetry, cultural phenomena, right? Like the felt sense in culture, even around anxiety, around the climate crisis, is a kind of negative expression of this integrality, right? This feeling that we're doing it all wrong. Like, we're kind of, the whole thing's falling apart. But the shadow of that, the whole thing's falling apart feeling, on the flip side, is there's a whole thing. There's this hidden sense of continuity in things. So I think a lot of it has to do with pointing that out. And maybe as a final point too, like Bonita Roy talks a bit about this. There's different ways to go meta. And one of her last ways that she talks about is this participatory holistic sense. And I would actually say that's kind of first. It's like behind and before and through and then after all of these other really cool cognitive conceptual ways of doing it. So I would say, be on the lookout for abstraction, and also be very attentive to perception, right? And how we're using our own forms of thinking. It's always difficult. It's like what McLuhan says, like, how do you get a fish to know it's wet? How do we get people in the perspectival world, which we all are, to get a sense that, it's our own orientation around sense making that is going through this crisis, right? And then how do we rework that? And those are I don't have all the answers to those questions, but it begins with an examination of felt sense and perception. And not necessarily with just grokking it conceptually or intellectually or in a map, right? So that's the difficulty.
Yeah, everything you're saying makes me think about that kind of gap that exists between knowledge and understanding, between information streams and assimilation.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're outputting information, do you think about that in terms of, are people getting what I'm saying, or are they just receiving it? Because we live in a situation where there are so many incoming information streams. There's no real way to tell, even if somebody seems like they're hooked up to really high quality incoming streams. Is it becoming part of them, or are they just being bathed in a vast myriad of information that is so, there's such a plethora of it that we become almost immune to it? How do we deal with a hypersomatic environment in terms of really singling things out and making sure we understand them? How do you know you understand? How do you try to understand, say, the podcasts you listen to? And how do you hope people try to make sense of what you're saying rather than just being bathed in the digits for a few minutes.
I mean, there's no way to guarantee it, right? I mean, it really is what somebody brings to their attention and their perception. But I think that's sort of what we need to help people practice, just as a general orientation, because, like you said, we live in this time where there's just a flood of available media to consume and different reality tunnels to jump down. I think there's been quite a few writers talking about this kind of like, I'm thinking of James Bridle's book, A New Dark Age, and the thesis of the book is that the utopian project of making a flood of information available for everybody through Wikipedia and the internet, etc. We have so much information that's accessible to us, but there's really no curation. There's no real structure in sort of evaluating all of that information or presenting it in a human-centric way, so that the sort of the enantiodromia has occurred, right? The thing becoming its opposite. This utopian age of infinite access to information at our fingertips, in our pockets, and on our screens in every single home, has had the contrary effect of collapsing a sense of shared knowledge, a sense of shared world, right? Or a sense of like even what is going on. There's so many different battling counter narratives. So like that's the kind of environment that we're swimming in. So I would say, like as a general orientation, like the whole thesis of coming down to earth is both an invitation to get familiar with our senses and our felt sense in terms of how am I encountering these mediums, what am I bringing to them, and then also in terms of practices, I don't think they're that complicated. Like in terms of this, right? We know there's an environmental crisis. We have this feeling that the whole is kind of broken. So we know that there's this need to basically rework everything, right? So I think we should trust those felt senses the most in this regard, right? Observing our senses, orienting ourselves around the human, and then also when it comes to like problem solving and solutions, like Latour talks about, it's like, okay, well, how do we help people in mutual aid? How do we assist people where they're at right now? Trumpers and leftists are going to be dealing with a century of climate disruption. So how are we going to survive this and outlive this crisis in a very real, tangible way? Like, are we raising our kids to get familiar with working with growing plants and other subsistence questions, right? We're really restructuring our whole orientation towards an age of climate disruption. So I would say that's another way to kind of get oriented. Let's get down to earth. People are doing it naturally through this crisis. Like they're growing their own food in their backyards now. They're learning how to bake bread and cook a lot and have vegetable gardens and so on. So I think that's a hopeful reorientation that I see happening through this. But I think we're going to be needing more of that. And then I guess the last point would be, on that note, try to see a crisis as a learning opportunity. Like Michelle Bowens calls it, a pedagogical catastrophe. And I love that term. It's the sense that, okay, the way in which things are falling apart can tell us about how we need to reorient. So again, we're all coming down to earth. We're fixating on supply chains. We're growing food in our backyards. We're wondering if maybe we need different or multiple streams of economic systems that are going on at the same time, things that are more resilient, right? Things that are more regional and bottom up and democratic. So all of the kind of pressures and the answers and solutions to those pressures, even if they're not being listened to, I think that's a helpful orientation, right? That's a helpful sense of sense making in this regard, in that we're not totally in the dark. There's certain directions, there's certain themes that are arising through this crisis that we can really kind of hone in on and clarify. And I think that's what I would probably say in response to navigating all of this. And don't worry about everything going on up here. What's coming online down here with everybody? What are we all concerned about?
Well, that seems to be the area we can get the most agreement on in immediate action.
Yeah.
Right? Like I think it is. That's a great term, pedagogical crisis. I think the extra pressure reveals where the holes are, at all levels of the system, and partly because we're all sort of quarantined in our own lives. That's where we have to focus, and yet there's also a danger that no matter how well you adapt within your mind and world and family and life, that the source of the problems are up here at a scale and a tempo that's untouched by even the greatest change of the individuals we can imagine. So what do we do with that? Like, what changes operate at the scale and tempo of the actual problems? Because I always think, in my mind, one of the reasons to be progressive is we're in a boat and 3 liters of water are coming into the boat per minute, and we're arguing whether we should elect somebody who wants to bail out 1 liter a minute or 2 liters a minute.
Yeah.
Both of those are going to sink the boat. So neither of them are happening at the tempo of the change or at the scale of the change. And so even though it's nicer for you in the short term, what solutions can actually fix the problem at the level the problem is being generated, which isn't necessarily our own lives?
Right. That's an excellent question. Part of that answer is understanding, and this is the kind of concession that I've been coming around to. The consolidation of power at that top level, right, is so ossified, so entrenched that, I don't think there's any way to directly come at that, and I think we're going to have to exist in this tension that is, we can really only answer things, not in the individual, but we can really only answer things socially, right? We can really only answer things in terms of the commons. And that might begin with our local community. It might extend a little bit further into supporting the creation of new unions. These are kind of the halfway answers, right? Because unions still exist in this whole superstructure that's falling apart, right? And we're dealing with this larger climate crisis, which is just outside of this entire institution, right? All of the different institutions, it's outside of that. We're coming down to earth. The whole thing is coming crashing into the planet, into the terrestrial. And here we are trying to work out democratization of labor, more egalitarian economic system, etc. So I think it requires us to kind of see what we're doing in the system may not be necessarily a direct translation into a complete solution, but also the tension is the system's going to have to fall apart, actually. And part of the impetus for creating more macro solutions is, as those macro institutions begin to collapse, there's going to be need and pressure for alternatives that work and scale. And I think, Schmachtenberger talks about that a little bit, Daniel Schmachtenberger. But again, thinking of the peer-to-peer folks and Michelle Bowens, who wrote a great little essay called Corona in the Commons, where he kind of goes, okay, let's assess what's going on. And, his thing is look, we don't yet have a peer-to-peer common-centric, post-capitalist civilization that's able to scale up to the billions or millions of people, that we have in the world. So what we're really going to have to do is sort of mediate that and work on the local, while we have our eye on, what we can do to help these things emerge, scale, and become more resilient at larger scales for larger people. But part of that has to do with actually allowing those things to go through their death process. And I think this is the hardest thing for us to really swallow. A lot of us already have a sense of nihilism or surrender or depression around, let's say the US government being able to do much in response to the climate crisis, just a complete ineptitude or impotence. And part of that is absolutely true, which again just points to the work needs to be us learning how to build alternatives, in our neighborhoods. Is there some kind of community commons that we can start working on? Is there some kind of rent strike we can assist with, or labor organization that we can support? Everything that is human centric, right, I think we should really be focusing on any kind of mutual aid efforts, any kind of alternative economics, any kind of regional cooperatives. I think these are going to be the necessary future anyway, as these monolithic structures continue to go under their own weight. And there needs to be things in place as they do. And I think what we've seen, again, pedagogical crisis, pedagogical catastrophe. What have, regions of the United States been doing in answer to the Trump administration? Well, creating their own little, tri-state pacts about how they're going to open up their economy or not, flexing their own kind of California doing that, we're our own nation state thing, like whatever. Like, I'm not too involved in that, but the regional, the bioregional, and then what Murray Bookchin talks about in terms of municipalism, I think might be an image of what the future looks like, a much more decentralized world where the problems of scaling might be easier to solve because you're not necessarily going, I need to figure out a macro system for 300 million people. It's, I need to figure out a macro system for my bioregion, right, with everybody else who's here, and share that with other people with their own solutions. So I think there's going to be a kind of implosion of this homogeny of the industrial nation state, but that's just my opinion. But I do sense that might be what's coming down the pipe. A necessary decentralization.
It's a scary possibility.
Yeah,
Like,
it is.
I look at like the difference between our two countries. My country's had a pretty smooth rollout of handling the situation. Everything's going pretty well for most. The system is being kept intact.
Yeah.
The other side of that is the current federal control system is reinforced by its success. Your system, it looks like there's tremendous amounts of corruption and botching and even intentional screwing it up. But the other side of that might be a hastening of the breakdown of the existing system.
Mm-hmm.
But can you, in a good conscience, urge on the collapse of the system?
I don't think I need to. I don't think we need to. I think it's another interesting quote from Gebser. He says, what is happening today, and he was speaking of mid-century, World War II, and then the whole crisis around the atomic age. He says, what is happening today happens almost of itself. And I think when it comes to these things, we don't really, there's no energy should be put into urging on the collapse. All of our energy should be put into democratizing the commons, in innovating forms of mutual aid, creating forms of resilience at the local level, and then building solidarity and coalition building, with other communities around the planet that are trying to do the same thing in the face of climate collapse. It's not really like the collapse is already kind of on its way. It's already, happening of itself. Our solution needs to be productive, constructive, resilience growing, right? Regenerative culture techniques and policies, etc. So any way we can do that and innovate that and share our tools with each other around the planet, this is not just a sense of like resisting capitalism. It's like, all right, the whole thing's going down. We need to figure out what we're going to do about it. The boat's already going to sink. Like, what do we do with everybody in the lifeboats? Can we construct something? How do we get out of here together, right? And what we're dealing with, of course, is like Latour talks about, like there's still agencies and forces, obviously this way of life doesn't want to end, right? I mean, neoliberalism wants to go on and somehow outlive the Anthropocene. So we're dealing with that as well. We're dealing with a kind of an ideology that's literally, as Latour says, is out of this world. It's just not even on Earth. It's not dealing with these terrestrial realities. So we need to be dealing with that. So that's what I would say. Like, no way, no good conscience should we say like, yes, fall apart quicker. But the question is more of like, okay, how do we mitigate the suffering that this is going to cause? Like, what can we do now to minimize the amount of suffering and global displacement, population displacement, and starvation and supply chain disruptions that are going to be happening in this century, in the next few centuries, probably. Like, what can we do to really mitigate that? And, obviously, the solutions are not all forthcoming, But I think we do have more people today talking about this and innovating around it, which is a hopeful sign. So I know I don't have a very, I don't have a typically like a progressive utopian vision of a future that's just getting better and better. But I hope that through this, humanity can really find a way to live very well with the planet in a way that perhaps we haven't consciously done, and since civilization started, right? Like we're really kind of learning how to earn our place here in the biosphere right now, and I hope we do.
I think progressivism maybe inauthentically, but possibly authentically, has been over associated with the utopian idea for a while. And I think really what we're talking about is moving forward in a more graceful fashion. Because if I were to characterize the three factions in, say, American politics, which I think epitomizes world politics to some degree, some people are accelerating the collapse. Some people want to manage and slightly decelerate the collapse, and other people want to smooth out the collapse so it's as non-destructive as possible. But we obviously could exchange a lot about politics. Possibly I should come on to Growing Down and just talk exclusively with you about that. This ostensibly is about podcasting, and I feel like it behooves me to try to direct it back that way a little bit, maybe with some forced questions.
That's fine. We can
Who would you, if you could have anybody to talk to on a podcast, anybody in the world, who would you love to talk to?
Oh gosh. All right. Oh boy. Anybody. I think for Growing Down, I would probably want us to, there's a whole bunch of people that we've been talking about, our dream interviewees. But I would personally love to have Bruno Latour. I don't know if he ever does podcasts, but that would be fantastic. Maybe I'm just thinking here, Bernie Sanders. That would be a lot of fun. And in the vein of progressive left, I think it would be cool to actually have The Hill on, Crystal Ball, and Sagar and Jetty. I think that would be very fun. I love what they're doing with their show, and they wrote that book called The Populist Guide to 2020. And I really think they've helped kind of move the public discussion and present themselves in a way, like, I don't know if you've seen their show, but they're just like any mainstream news anchor, right? It's a very professional setting, and they look like they'd be on CNN or something, and yet they're just dropping the progressive economic message, and they're just tearing apart centrism, and it's just this great way of presenting. They've really, really played with the medium, and I would love to talk with them about that, just like the kind of their thinking and their strategy around presenting themselves in a kind of a trickster fashion, like the mainstream journalists would be doing, and yet introducing in it like a Trojan horse all of these progressive concepts. So I would love it if we could have them on Growing Down, and of course Bernie as well. Postmortem on his campaign would be very fascinating. With Mutations, I feel like fortunate enough that like I have the people I want to talk to on there. But because I know a lot of them, they're in the network. We're in the network together. So I feel quite content with the folks that I have on there. So yeah, I think I would say Crystal Ball and Sagar and Jetty for sure.
That's a great answer. I really admire what they're doing, and I think the reframing of what progressive populism means that you get from seeing a right and left perspective on it together is fantastic. My girlfriend just tweeted them the other day, like trying to encourage them to have more of their friends come on and try to model the discussion of how the right and left populists can actually work out a consensus together.
Yeah, that's a great. I think they need to do that more too. It's a great point. It's the most interesting element, I think, of their show, which is how does a leftist, right, like and a conservative align about economic progressivism? That seems like that would be so contrary to the polemics of U.S. politics, or let alone just politics in general. So the way in which they do is, of course, our understanding of economic progressivism, which is focusing on labor, et cetera, et cetera. So, I think that would be really great. I think it would be wonderful to see, and genuinely like productive to see a meeting of minds, and just kind of giving people more permission to think in that way, right? It sort of builds a culture in that way, or the potential for one, and perhaps a movement. So I would love it. I hope they listen. I hope they listen. That's a great recommendation. But yeah, I think, it would be fun too, just like the normal progressive podcast / show circuit of like Glenn Greenwald and just sort of the larger circuit of folks who are talking about these things. And because like for us, right, we're integralists, so we have a slightly weird position on these things, and we're trying with some varying success to kind of reach into that larger rung of the leftist media circuit. Like Michael Brooks is a friend of mine, so we've been talking, and he's kind of a closet integralist, so that's been fun, right? Like I think he was involved in the integral community a number of years ago, and so we've had like off the air conversations just about his experiences and navigating what how to present these ideas to the left in a way that's like palatable and something that they'll actually swallow. So more of that would be really fun. I would be curious just to like interview like Crystal, for instance, on some of our integral ideas and what she thinks about that, or what she thinks about maybe cultural evolution, right? Or putting them in exposure to integral thinkers. Like we had Steve McIntosh on, and Steve has an interesting, he has that new book called Developmental Politics that just came out a few months ago, and he's got an interesting position on how do you kind of overcome political polemics and the polarities of the left and the right by focusing on values. And I would just be curious, like, what do you think of that, Crystal? Like, you interview people from all over the spectrum on your show. Do you think that would be a way to get to them? So I would love that kind of conversation. That'd be very, very exciting to see.
Yeah, there's a lot of action, I think, to be unpacked still at this. What is meta progressivism, right? What is because one of the things you get in the integral community is a sort of attempt to have a balanced overview. You're going to say we're going to honor all these stages of values, and we're going to honor the left and the right, and you can kind of sit back and try to affirm all of that. On the other way you can go is there's a through line among all these stages, and there's an emerging convergence of left and right, and we should figure out what that is and double down on it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's very difficult. I've had a lot of conversations with Steve, and one of the difficult things for me is to unpack the difference between levels and value systems. Right? Because when I really like the way he breaks down the value systems, but I find it problematic to associate that with the different blocks like conservative, liberal, progressive, because I think they all demonstrate all of those values in their own way.
No, that's a great point. Yeah. I mean, just like taking, for example, the sort of conservative, traditionalist value systems, and what would we normally associate with traditionalist? I don't remember off the top of my head what Steve talks about, but just generally associating with like the family, religious values, traditional family values, that kind of thing, individualism, I guess, right? But if you go to thinking of any leftist would be like, I have a deep spiritual tradition, and maybe some of them are rooted in liberation theology, right? So that like the salvation of the self is linked to the salvation of the communitas, right? So they just see it that way, right? And it's very traditional, right? So it gets messy. I think it gets complicated, and it's not as clearly delineated as exactly as you're saying. This is a question too, because like I'm kind of a Gebserian, obviously, in the growing down triad. Ryan is my other co-host. He's kind of in between. I think I've sold him very well on the Gebserian stuff. And Matt is coming more from the integral theory and meta-modern perspective, but we're kind of literate in all of those domains. So, this is something we're always bringing up, like what is the best way to kind of overcome some of these polemics and the tribalization and sort of fragmentation of the left and the right? Like, do we do this sort of value-oriented thing? Is there some kind of integral mediation thing we need to still figure out? Is it more of like what I'm talking about with like understanding the ground or the background in which we swim, which is perspectivalism, which doesn't really come at mediation directly or come at the left and the right directly, but tries to understand sort of these underlying environmental conditions that need to change. And maybe it's all three. I don't know, but this is definitely the theme that comes up quite a bit in our conversations with folks. And Matt's great. Matt, like he'll ask anybody onto the show. Like we reached out to Tiger King's campaign manager. That didn't work out, but like we're trying to, and this is like to Matt's credit too. Like let's talk with everybody across the whole spectrum, right? So and really try to understand them from this integral perspective. So I really like what he's doing because we've gotten some great opportunities out of it. Like the last one we did was with Delman Coates, who is he's a pastor, I think, in Baltimore, Maryland, of a very large Christian African American congregation, about 15,000 people, and he's an advocate of MMT. So he's kind of bringing this traditionalist Christian perspective with the tradition of Martin Luther King, right? So it's very progressive, and basically using or working the spiritual community into also a socially transformative community. He's doing a lot of educational projects around MMT and changing public opinion on money and spending of public money. MMT is modern monetary theory, and I wouldn't be able to explain it to you too well myself. But it's relatively an economically progressive theory about like why we should actually print money basically in a responsible way for the public good. And it tries to argue that and kind of go like the argument that they always bring up in all of the debates against Bernie and against things like Medicare for all and against, universal basic income or whatever is always, how are you going to pay for it? Where is it going to come from? And the argument that Coates is bringing up is like, well, we always go to, well, we're going to tax the rich a little bit, or maybe we're going to have to raise taxes a little bit. But no one ever has the answer that, let's say, the military does, which is we're just going to print the money. We need this much of a budget for the military this year, and we're going to get it. The Pentagon just gets it. Why don't we do this for the public good? Why don't we print money for the public good in a responsible way? Instead of that, we're going and like arguing on their terms, like, oh, we'll eke it out from the billionaires and we'll get a little bit from here and we'll patch it together. So it's trying to transform that perception in the public eye, and he's doing all these educational projects around that. So we talked with him. He doesn't know anything about integral theory. But in the context of that conversation, it was fun to see him just sort of bring together the social, the political, the spiritual, and then also in this vision of transforming culture, moving into a better culture. And that's, I think anyway, like integrality implicitly at work. Here's a guy bringing in integral theory terminology, the different quadrants, right? He's talking about money. He's talking about the individual in a society, a better society, the individual in our sick society, and then here's a spiritual vision of that as well, right? And here's a transformation of that. So there's this evolutionary aspect of it. So we want to bring more people on like that, right? Implicitly integral people, like finding integral out there. So that's sort of, I'm just rambling now, but
that's a great approach, I think. I mean, I've been making this distinction between integralists who are first in theory integral lights who are just living it. And then what the theory does is just describe the kind of life or cognition those people just happen to have.
Yeah.
But they're out there and they don't necessarily know that they have anything in common. And if you can elicit from them, if you can unpack those structures, then it becomes very obvious. That's a tremendous, I think, service to this kind of a vision space.
Yeah.
I like also, I mean, there's a question of what sort of aesthetics this kind of a medium should be moving towards. right? It's very obvious that it's a more, I want to say amateur, more relaxed setting, right? It's people in their houses. You don't have to shave as much.
Yeah.
But also it's more vivid and it's more oriented toward odd conjunctions like Tiger King's campaign manager. That's a great get for any podcast because it's just vivid and interesting. It's something you can dig into and you're bound to find some strange energies and odd convergences in there.
Yeah.
But I wonder if you have any other impressions of the kind of aesthetic that podcasts are distinguished by or are moving towards.
Yeah, great question. I think on the one hand, the pandemic has reset our expectations of podcasting, because I think for a while podcasting has started to become a little bit out of reach of the everyday person to just start one up. I mean, and on the other hand, it's even more in reach just in terms of software access. Like we use Anchor FM, which is this platform, and I'm not like promoting them exactly, but I do think examples like that, they make it very easy to upload things. There's an app, there's like a very intuitive, streamlined process where you don't really need to know too much about sound editing to throw an episode up. So yes, that's easier. But I think the other trend has been people have been getting more professional. They've been getting like stage lighting and really nice cameras, and if you've got the money for it, you get your like what do you call it? The $400 Shure microphone, the one that like all the like Joe Rogan has. So like there's a lot of investment people have been throwing at podcasts as they get more popular and as bigger like media ecologies, like let's say Rolling Stone, for instance, they started what was it, Useful Idiots, I think it's called. I forget the name of it, but production values start climbing. And I think with the coronavirus happening and everybody being thrown back into their bedrooms and apartments, who previously used, stage and studio settings, there's been a helpful reset to see like people just kind of streaming in through Zoom. I'm like, oh, okay, we've got an equal playing field now. Like they don't have any better setup than I do at this point, some of them. So in terms of aesthetics, yeah, I think, I don't really feel like there ever needs to be anything beyond a clear audio, right? And interesting curation. And again, that's like the human aspect of it. It's like, can the podcast hosts curate very interesting conversations with interesting people? Just like a good radio show would be able to do. It could be eccentric. It could be just like, depending on the aesthetic and the podcast genre. Like I love Weird Studies because they'll talk about H.P. Lovecraft and spooky Catholicism and McLuhan in one conversation. And I just love that combination, right? So I just think interesting conversations, and that's a very human thing. Like, how do we discern what that means? And
There's a little, there's a question for me there.
Yeah.
Because you're like, there doesn't need to be more than interesting curation and decent audio.
Mm-hmm.
But is that, doesn't need to be more? Sounds like it's the minimal condition.
Yeah.
But is it the minimal condition or is it the target condition? Like for you personally, when you see things going in the direction of higher production value, does that make you think, oh, this is getting better and better? Or does it make you hesitant? Like maybe they're going away from the mood it should be having?
Yeah, the latter. I don't know if a great production studio, even if you build it in your house, I don't really know if that adds anything to it, or it becomes something else. Like it becomes, rather than being a podcast and being that kind of like generative, organic, good audio conversational space that we're talking about, like that's the center for me, right? The periphery or the alternative would be like, okay, you set up a great studio, you've got a YouTube channel now, and like everything looks really professional. I think you're going for something else there, which is fine, but I think you're going for maybe like a YouTube show style, or like you're going for like a lot of leftist media goes for, like I'm thinking of like the Progressive Voice, or there's a few YouTube channels that are progressive. They set up a studio and they kind of look semi-formal, and because they want, the part of that is the optics of like looking like they're a journalist, right? They're a new journalist of the internet age. So there's some kind of combination there. That's fine. And then there's this other aspect of it, which, you know, podcasts are not the only thing now, right? Like we think about Twitch and you know, a lot of podcasters go on Twitch. A lot of like progressive media is on Twitch. Thinking of like Hassan. I don't know if you follow Hassan's work. He's got a big YouTube Twitch channel, tons of viewers, like hundreds of thousands. And his setup is very simple. He's just like at his computer desk with like a microphone setup, like in a back room somewhere. It's nothing too fancy. And yet he's got tons of viewers, right? He's just like, he's always generating some kind of like mimetic content on Twitter due to his live shows. And that's kind of like formal, informal, you know, and that's like a whole other thing. So I would just say that the aesthetic is interesting, but I don't think it ever needs to get like hyper professional. I don't think it adds anything.
I would tend to agree. Like, I enjoy when somebody tries to do a hybrid in terms of the optics between the old style and the new style. That's great. It's its own thing. But where I get excited is where it seems like it's more ragged, more embedded in people's lives. I had a conversation a couple of weeks ago with a friend of mine on the West Coast about Buddhism, and he was arguing with his daughter when it started. So the first thing I saw was him looking off screen going, "Put some clothes on." And in my brain, I thought, I'm going to start every video that way from now on. That's gold. And I thought, what is it? Like, what am I recognizing there? Says to me, and I'm not really going to do that, but part of me says, yeah, that should be your signature move. It should seem omnidirectional, a little haphazard, even intentionally embedded in things that are quasi-professional at best.
Yeah. That's a great question. I don't know if we can really answer it directly, but that made me think of that sort of viral video of the guy who was being interviewed on some kind of news station from his home office, and his baby like breaks into the back door in the periphery, and then the next baby comes rolling in on the walker, and then the mom comes in and grabs them both, and there's just like, and that was earlier on where that like really wasn't something that happened too often, I guess. So, but now it's happening all the time. And actually during COVID, there's just like, hey, yeah, embrace the kind of like informalities. And I think, again, you know, it's the medium of not just video, but like the oral medium that we're retrieving through electronic culture that like has room for all of that kind of messiness. And it feels good. It feels like more alive. It feels less scripted and prompted. It feels like, oh, this is just the dynamics of being a person, the ambient telepresence of that other person. You know, a lot of people describe podcasts, I've noticed, like as podcasters they really like as being almost their friends, right? I mean, that might sound a little sad, but I don't think it's really intended that way. There's a kind of intimacy in the podcast medium. And so when you see stuff like that, like funny things like, you know, family interjecting, there's just a sense of like being there with someone, you know. And again, this crisis, if there's anything positive that's come out of it, it's been this capacity to actually experience these mediums in a way not only that is novel, but is human centric, right? Like we're valuing Zoom casts and conversations in a way that we hadn't before, because for a lot of us, it's the only way to really connect with our friends. It's the only way to really be social at the moment. So it's not that we are projecting anything into the medium itself. It's just that like, actually we've retracted the mundanity of the medium and went, oh, I'm connecting with another person here. This is great. Like this is actually me reaching another, rather than kind of going, oh, another Zoom call, whatever, you know. Right. So there's a way in which, again, the enantiodromia has happened here, where social isolation during the pandemic has reversed the typicality, the mundanity of digital communication, and actually brought forward the human again, which I think is very cool. I think that's very exciting. We'll see what happens when quarantine ends and we all go back to, like, you know, being in person again. But yeah, I don't know. I think, you know, there's an unfortunate byproduct of any communication media where eventually it gets kind of like, whatever, you know, Zoom is whatever, I don't care, Facebook's whatever. But suddenly now we're bringing so much more to it because it's like the only way to connect with another human being.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. There's something about the human-centric nature of podcasting and the auditory experience that I think is.
I think those are excellent points. I like the idea of the otherness and the orality as really contributing to the particular aesthetic, because in that scenario with my friend yelling off screen, two things are obviously happening. One is I'm seeing more of his life, which is the reality of the other to me. The other thing that's going on there is it's more like the retrieval of the archaic fireside chat, right? Where you're not just all listening to the prepackaged output of the elder in full regalia.
Yeah.
It's going back and forth, and you're constantly, a deer just wandered into the campsite. So you got to deal with that for a second, and it's weird, and it's off screen, and then you're back. That kind of like orality has that permeability to it.
Yes.
Because the rest of the village is impinging upon the discussion circle at all times.
Yes, I love that. That's as you were describing that, I was thinking of McLuhan's word for that, which is there's a simultaneity of auditory experience, right? Like you can't, like with the eye, when you're reading something, or even sort of like watching something on television or a polished television show, you can kind of pick apart certain things. You can focus on one thing and on another thing. But auditory, you can't. You hear everything. Everything is just sort of in your field. And so like it's a whole sensory surround where everything's sort of co-arising at the same time. Like you said, like this person's talking, this person's laughing, the fire is crackling, a deer wanders in the periphery. All of that, all of these different sounds are all happening simultaneously. So there's a kind of a field awareness. And I think that's what I meant by kind of like ambient co-presence in the podcast or in the Zoom call. You know, there's this sense of like being there with another person, and the kind of medium you're looking at isn't linear. It's this auditory simultaneity of just sort of ambient co-presence of the field. And that field awareness McLuhan talks about with auditory culture, he suggests is being retrieved somehow in electronic culture. And I think the podcast is actually, you know, I kind of wish you lived to see it or hear it, right? Because of how much it is exemplifying this auditory retrieval through electronic media. So yeah, I think there's something hopeful in that, and a culture that's overemphasizing the eye as the organ of perception is receiving a necessary remediation of the ear and of the listening and of the field, right? And one wonders too, because this is the direction McLuhan goes with this question, like, okay, if we're going to start using this medium, this field awareness, then how is that going to affect our aesthetics, our culture, our sciences, our arts? What happens when we start to really just kind of play in the field again, you know? And the hopeful thing would be, you know, we take this into this vision of the global village that McLuhan talks about, or this vision of an aperspectival world that Gebser talks about, and they'll go, okay, well, that field awareness could be very useful and very helpful right now in a time of going meta and climate crisis and hyper objects, because it's that kind of awareness that is very good at kind of going like, yeah, there's a deer here and this is happening here simultaneously, rather than the eye that tries to causally link them all together in a more linear chain of sequence. So can this style or medium begin to affect the way we think and perceive, perhaps for the better, and perhaps more appropriate for an age of systemic restructuring, collapse, and rebirth that are all kind of happening at the same time in the field, right? So that's what I'm hoping for. That's my pitch for podcasts. Like,
yeah. I mean, it's pretty clear to me that integral philosophy and its analogs have persisted in a little bit of the exaggerated emphasis of the eye, right? The vision logic and the world view and all that kind of stuff still needs to be broken up a little bit into more of a balance with the oral and the tactile, as McLuhan predicted.
Yeah.
Let's say we're coming to the end here, because how long are people going to listen to us talk about podcasting? What would you ask other podcasters? Presumably, I'm going forward to talk to more people who are doing this. What are you curious about in terms of their experience and in terms of a group of people collectively who might be trying to get higher perspectives across in this kind of medium? What would you ask them?
As a kind of recommendation, to a practice, or
Well, what would you be curious about in terms of something you could learn from them? What would you be curious about in terms of what does it turn out to be that you are all doing together?
yeah, yeah. I I don't know. I have like the only answer that comes to mind is something Conor Habib brings up frequently on his podcast. It's a Rudolf Steiner line. Conversation will be the new Eucharist. He says in the future, conversation will become the new Eucharist. And I love that. I think that's we should hold to that kind of vision or hearken to that kind of participatory sense of what we're actually doing when we come together and do this. Like we're partaking in a spiritual vision of the world, which is whole again, which is simultaneous, which is the field. So when we're here together, we're talking ourselves into this new world, if that makes sense, right? It doesn't need to be a linear project. It doesn't have to be a finished goal. It's just about being co-present with each other in this field as the world is arising. And I think in that sense, the Eucharistic vision of this is how do we transfigure the world in this way, right? Well, the mystical vision of the podcast would be that it's in communion with one another, right? It's in communion with the world. In communion, communitas, right? There's this extended vision of not only human beings in this planetary sense, but in the non-human world as well, right? In the communitas is the extended non-human beings and other kin that Donna Haraway discusses. So radically speaking, podcasting conversations is to be in communion with the world, right? To transfigure the world in this new participatory sense. And when we do this, let's think about it that way. I think seeing it as a container like that might actually generate more fruitful, more diaphanous, more generative conversations. So I don't know, that's what comes to mind.
That is a fantastic place to come to an end. The Mystic Podcast as an example of the emergent participatory sacred communion as the new Dharma.
Yes.